2 words. That's all it took. 2 words spoken by a man in Saudi Arabia, broadcast across the world in real time, absorbed by millions of screens in milliseconds. 2 words that erased 167 years of history, vaporized billions of dollars of wealth, and ended one of the most storied financial institutions in human history. Absolutely not. When Ammar al-Qudairy, chairman of the Saudi National Bank, uttered those 2 words on March 15, 2023, he probably didn't know he was signing a death warrant. He was answering a simple question from a Bloomberg television reporter. Would his bank provide more capital to Credit Suisse if needed? His answer was honest. It was technically accurate, and it was absolutely catastrophic. Within hours of those 2 words hitting the airwaves, Credit Suisse shares plunged 24%. Within days, the bank was dead. Within a week, a 167-year-old institution, a bank that had survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the 2008 financial crisis, and every other calamity of the modern era, was sold for $3.25 billion. To put that in perspective, Credit Suisse was worth $96 billion at its peak in 2007. They sold it for roughly the price of a mid-sized tech startup, for less than Elon Musk spent on Twitter, for about what a professional sports team costs these days. You're about to discover why everything you thought you knew about banking stability is wrong, because Credit Suisse didn't die from a single blow. It died from 1,000 cuts inflicted over years, ignored by everyone who should have been paying attention. And the story of how that happened reveals something terrifying about the world we live in. In the age of Twitter, a bank can go from troubled to dead in the time it takes to scroll through your feed. This is not just a story about finance. This is a story about trust, about how trust is built over centuries and destroyed in seconds, about how the most powerful institutions in the world can be brought to their knees by rumors, by tweets, by 2 words spoken on live television. This is the story of Credit Suisse, the bank that was too big to fail until it wasn't, the Swiss icon that became a global punchline, the 167-year-old institution that died because nobody could trust it anymore. And if you think this couldn't happen to your bank, to your country, to your life-saving stay until the end, because the forces that killed Credit Suisse are still out there, and they're not done yet. To understand how Credit Suisse died, you need to understand how it lived, because this wasn't just any bank. This was Switzerland. This was neutrality and discretion and centuries of financial expertise wrapped in alpine precision. This was the bank that wealthy people around the world trusted with their darkest secrets. Credit Suisse was founded in 1856 by a man named Alfred Escher. Picture Zurich in the mid-19th century, a city of cobblestone streets and church spires, nestled against the impossibly blue waters of Lake Zurich, with the snow-capped Alps visible on the horizon. Switzerland was transforming from a rural backwater into a modern industrial power, and it needed financial infrastructure to fuel that transformation. Escher was a visionary, a politician, an entrepreneur. He understood that Switzerland's future lay in connecting itself to the broader European economy. He founded Credit Suisse specifically to fund the construction of railways, the Internet of the 19th century, the technology that was reshaping how people and goods moved across the continent. The bank's original name was Schweizerische Kreditanstalt, Swiss credit institution, nothing flashy, nothing ashy, just a solid, reliable name for a solid, reliable bank. And for the next century and a half, that's exactly what Credit Suisse was. Solid, reliable, boring even, the kind of bank where wealthy families parked their money for generations. The kind of bank that didn't make headlines because making headlines was the opposite of what Swiss banking was supposed to be about. The headquarters at Parade Platz in Zurich became a symbol of Swiss financial power. Picture the building, massive, stone-faced, imposing in that particularly European way that says, "We've been here forever and will be here forevermore." The architecture itself was designed to communicate permanence. to whisper to anyone who walked through those heavy doors, "Your money is safe here. Your secrets are safe here." We have been trusted by kings and emperors, by industrialists and aristocrats, by people who needed absolute discretion for reasons they never had to explain. That was the Credit Suisse brand. Discretion. Stability. The Swiss vault that nothing could crack. But here's what they don't teach you about institutional reputation. It's like a savings account that takes decades to build and seconds to empty. Credit Suisse spent 167 years accumulating trust, and then, in the span of about 2 years, they burned through all of it. Let me introduce you to the cast of characters who would preside over this disaster, because every tragedy needs its players, and Credit Suisse had plenty. First, there's Ulrich Kerner, the final CEO, brought in during 2022 to execute a transformation plan that was supposed to save the bank. Kerner was a Swiss-German banker with decades of experience, the kind of steady hand you bring in when the ship is taking on water. He had a plan. He had a timeline. He had absolutely no chance. Think about his position for a moment. Imagine being hired to renovate a house while it's actively on fire. That was Kerner's job. He was supposed to restructure Credit Suisse, cut costs, sell off risky business units, rebuild trust with clients while the bank was hemorrhaging money and clients and reputation every single day. Then there's Axel Lehmann, the chairman of the board, the man whose job was to oversee the entire enterprise and ensure proper governance. Just days before the collapse, Lehmann gave an interview where he insisted the bank's liquidity was strong. He seemed genuinely confident. He seemed genuinely surprised when everything fell apart. Was he lying, or was he simply the last person to understand what everyone else already knew? That's one of the haunting questions of this story. Now, you might be thinking, these sound like capable people. Experienced bankers. How could they not see what was coming? The truth is far more disturbing. They probably did see it coming. They just couldn't stop it. Because by the time Kerner and Lehmann took control, Credit Suisse was already dying from wounds inflicted years before. They inherited a patient in the ICU and were told to perform surgery with a butter knife. Let me tell you about the people who actually created those wounds. And the first name you need to know is Bill Hwang. Bill Hwang is not a household name, but he should be, because Bill Hwang inflicted one of the deepest cuts that would eventually kill Credit Suisse. Hwang ran a family office called Archegos Capital Management. Now, a family office sounds cozy, doesn't it? Like a small operation managing grandma's investments. But Archegos was anything but small. At its peak, Hwang controlled positions worth over $100 billion. Here's how he did it. And here's where it gets crazy. Hwang used financial instruments called total return swaps to build enormous positions in certain stocks without actually owning those stocks. It's complicated, but the basic idea is this. He paid banks to take on the risk of stock positions on his behalf. The banks owned the shares. Hwang got the profits or losses. Why would banks agree to this? Because they collected fees, massive fees. And as long as the stocks went up, everyone was happy. Archegos made money. The banks made money. Nobody asked too many questions. Credit Suisse was one of those banks. They loved Archegos, loved the fees, loved the business. They didn't love the risk management that should have accompanied that business, but hey details, right? In March 2021, the house of cards collapsed. One's concentrated positions, massive bets on a small number of stocks, started going against him. When stocks dropped, he faced margin calls. When he couldn't meet the margin calls, the banks started selling. When they started selling, the stocks dropped further. A death spiral. The banks that moved first, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, got out with minimal damage. They saw the fire and ran. Credit Suisse hesitated. They waited. They hoped things would stabilize. They lost $5.5 billion, $5.5 billion, in a matter of days, because they were too slow to exit positions they should never have been in. But here's the kicker. The Archegos disaster wasn't even the worst thing that happened to Credit Suisse that month. 2 weeks before Archegos exploded, another bomb went off. A company called Greensill Capital collapsed, and it took $3 billion of Credit Suisse's clients' money with it. Greensill was a supply chain finance company. That sounds boring, and it was until you understand what was actually happening. Greensill made loans to companies and then packaged those loans into funds that investors could buy. Credit Suisse sold those funds to their wealthy clients as safe investments. They were not safe. When Greensill imploded amid questions about the quality of its loans and its relationship with its largest borrower, Credit Suisse clients suddenly discovered that their safe investments were locked up in a legal morass that would take years to resolve. Some of them lost everything. Think about that for a second. These weren't degenerate gamblers playing with money they could afford to lose. These were wealthy, sophisticated clients who trusted Credit Suisse trusted that 167-year-old brand to protect their capital, and Credit Suisse had put them into funds that blew up. The reputational damage was incalculable. For a bank whose entire value proposition was trust us with your money, losing client money to a collapsed financial scheme was devastating. And here's where the timeline becomes important. Greensill collapsed in early March 2021. Archegos collapsed in late March 2021. In a single month, Credit Suisse took over $8 billion in losses and reputational hits that would echo for years. But did they learn? Did they clean house? Did they fundamentally change the way they did business? The honest answer is, sort of. They made changes. They fired some people. They hired new risk officers. They announced restructuring plans. But the cultural rot, the hubris, the arrogance, the assumption that they were too important to fail, that never really went away. And the scandals kept coming. If you've made it this far, you're about to learn why Credit Suisse was already a walking corpse by the time the final crisis hit. Because Greensill and Archegos were just the spectacular failures. The bank was riddled with problems that ran much deeper. Let me give you a taste of the scandals that plagued Credit Suisse in the years leading up to its death. In 2020, it emerged that Credit Suisse had been spying on its own employees, literally hiring private investigators to follow executives who had left the bank, apparently out of paranoia that they might be recruiting other staff. One of those surveillance operations ended with a confrontation in the streets of Zurich. It was bizarre. It was embarrassing. And it suggested a culture where trust had completely broken down. The bank's chief operating officer resigned over the spying scandal. The CEO followed shortly after. A bank that couldn't trust its own employees was asking clients to trust it with billions. Then there were the money laundering issues. In 2022, Credit Suisse became the first major Swiss bank to be found criminally guilty in a case involving money laundering for a Bulgarian cocaine trafficking gang. Let that sink in. A 167-year-old institution, synonymous with Swiss respectability, convicted of helping drug dealers wash their money. The bank was fined. Executives expressed regret. But the damage to the brand that was built entirely on discretion and trustworthiness was immense. There were tax evasion scandals. There were investigations in multiple countries. There were settlements and fines and legal costs that accumulated into the billions. And through it all, Credit Suisse kept insisting they were fixing things. Keep restructuring. Keep promising to do better. Keep asking clients to stick around while they sorted out their problems. Some clients did stick around, many didn't. And the slow bleed of assets under management, the metric that matters most for a wealth management bank, continued year after year. Now let me take you to October 2022, because this is when things shifted from slow decline to active crisis, and the catalyst was something that would have been unthinkable in any previous era of banking: a tweet. On October 1, 2022, a reporter named David Taylor posted a message on Twitter. He claimed that a major international investment bank was on the brink. He was vague about which bank, but the speculation immediately centered on Credit Suisse. The tweet went viral. Within hours, it had been seen by millions. Financial news outlets picked it up. Reddit threads exploded. The narrative formed with terrifying speed. Credit Suisse was about to collapse. Was the tweet accurate? Not exactly. Credit Suisse wasn't actually on the brink at that moment, at least not in the sense of imminent bankruptcy. They had liquidity. They had capital. They were troubled, yes, but not dying. But here's what the tweet revealed about modern banking. Reality matters less than perception. When millions of people start believing a bank is in trouble, the bank gets in trouble. Clients withdraw funds. Trading partners demand more collateral. Lenders get nervous. The very act of worrying about a bank run can cause a bank run. In the fourth quarter of 2022, following the Twitter firestorm, Credit Suisse experienced outflows of $119 billion. Let me say that again, $119 billion. In a single quarter, because of speculation, because of tweets, because of fear. Think about the mathematics of that. Credit Suisse managed about $1.5 trillion in assets. Losing $119 billion in a quarter meant losing almost 8% of their entire business in 90 days, and more importantly, it meant losing the clients who matter most, the wealthy individuals and institutions who generate the fees that keep a bank alive. Those clients weren't waiting around to see if Credit Suisse could fix their problems. They were moving their money to UBS, to Julius Baer, to any bank that wasn't making headlines for all the wrong reasons. Imagine being a Credit Suisse employee during this period. Imagine coming to work every day at that imposing headquarters on Parade Platz, walking past the stone facade that had meant safety for generations, and knowing that everything was slipping away. Imagine fielding calls from clients who were polite but firm. "We're moving our assets. Nothing personal. We just can't take the risk." The slow death was becoming a fast death, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Now let's talk about the week that ended everything. Because if October 2022 was the beginning of the end, March 2023 was the end of the end. On Friday, March 10, 2023, a bank in California called Silicon Valley Bank collapsed. SVB, as it was known, was a relatively small institution nowhere near the size of Credit Suisse, but it served the tech industry, and its failure sent shockwaves through global markets. Suddenly, investors everywhere were asking the same question: which bank is next? The answer, for millions of nervous depositors and investors, was obvious: Credit Suisse. Not because Credit Suisse had the same problems as SVB, they didn't. SVB failed because of interest rate risk and a concentrated depositor base. Credit Suisse was failing because of scandals and reputational collapse and years of mismanagement. The causes were completely different. But the market didn't care about nuance. The market cared about fear, and Credit Suisse was the obvious weak link in the global banking chain. On Tuesday, March 14th, Credit Suisse made an announcement that should have been routine. They reported that their auditors had found material weaknesses in their internal controls for financial reporting for the previous 2 years. In other words, their books weren't reliable. In normal times, this would have been bad news but not fatal. Banks discover control issues all the time. They fix them and move on. But these weren't normal times. These were times when every piece of bad news about Credit Suisse was treated as confirmation of the worst fears. The stock dropped. The credit default swaps instruments that let investors bet on whether a company will default spiked. The market was pricing in death. And then came Wednesday, March 15th. The day of the fatal quote. Picture the scene. It's late morning in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. The desert sun is blazing. Inside the glass towers of the financial district, executives are preparing for what should be a routine media appearance. Amr al-Qadari is the chairman of Saudi National Bank, which happens to be Credit Suisse's largest shareholder. They own just under 10% of the stock estate worth billions that has been losing value for months. A Bloomberg television reporter asks him a simple question. Would Saudi National Bank be willing to provide more capital to Credit Suisse if needed? Al-Qudari could have dodged the question. He could have said no comment or we're monitoring the situation. He could have said anything vague and non-committal that would have let everyone pretend things were fine for another few days. Instead, he told the truth. Absolutely not. He explained his reasoning. Saudi National Bank already owned nearly 10%. Regulatory rules prevented them from going above that threshold without triggering additional requirements. He wasn't rejecting Credit Suisse out of malice. He was simply stating a legal and practical reality. But context doesn't travel at the speed of Twitter. Only headlines do. Within seconds, literally seconds, the quote was on every screen in every trading floor around the world. Credit Suisse largest investor refuses to provide more capital. That was the headline. That was the story. That was the death sentence. Credit Suisse shares dropped 24% in a single day. The cost of insuring Credit Suisse debt against default spiked to levels that basically screamed, "This bank is finished." The market had rendered its verdict. Think about the brutality of that. 167 years of history, tens of thousands of employees, millions of clients, and it all came down to a quote taken out of context, transmitted around the world at the speed of light, absorbed by algorithms that don't understand nuance. Al-Qudari resigned from his position shortly afterward. His 2 words had cost his own bank billions and accelerated the destruction of an institution he had invested in. He became the most visible villain in a story that had many villains. But here's the myth we need to bust. Al-Qudari didn't kill Credit Suisse. He just spoke at its funeral. The bank was already dead. It just hadn't stopped moving yet. The next 48 hours were chaos. On Thursday, March 16th, Credit Suisse took emergency action. The Swiss National Bank, the country's central bank, agreed to provide a lifeline of $54 billion in emergency lending. It was an extraordinary intervention, the kind of thing central banks do only when systemic failure is on the line. For a brief moment, it seemed like it might work. The stock stabilized. The headline shifted from "Credit Suisse is dying" to "Credit Suisse gets rescue." But the lifeline wasn't enough. Because the problem wasn't just liquidity. The problem was trust. And no amount of emergency lending can restore trust once it's gone. On Friday, March 17th, the outflows continued. Clients were still pulling their money. $10 billion a day was leaving the bank. Every day, Credit Suisse was getting smaller, weaker, less viable. The Swiss government faced an impossible choice. They could let Credit Suisse fail and risk a global financial catastrophe as counterparties around the world faced losses and contagion spread. Or they could force a solution and potentially anger shareholders and bondholders who would see their investments wiped out. By Friday evening, the decision had been made. Credit Suisse would not survive the weekend as an independent bank. The only question was who would buy the corpse. The answer was UBS. The weekend of March 18 to 19, 2023 will go down in Swiss financial history as one of the most intense 48 hours ever experienced. Picture the scene inside the Swiss government buildings in Bern. The finance minister, Karen Keller-Sutter, is coordinating between regulators, bankers, and politicians. Nobody has slept properly in days. The conference room's smell of stale coffee and cold pizza, and the acrid sweat of people under impossible pressure. Outside, the world is watching. Asian markets will open on Monday morning. If there's no solution by then, the panic will spread. Other banks will be questioned. The contagion that killed Credit Suisse will jump to new hosts. The pressure is suffocating. Inside the Credit Suisse headquarters at Parade Platz, the atmosphere is funereal. Employees are showing up to work, not knowing if they'll have jobs by Monday. Some are crying, some are angry, some are just numb. One group of employees gathered outside the building and started chanting, "We are the bank." It was a desperate assertion of identity in a moment when that identity was being erased. We built this. We worked here. We believed in this. And now it's over. Meanwhile, in the UBS executive suites, a different drama is unfolding. UBS doesn't particularly want to buy Credit Suisse. The two banks are bitter rivals. They've competed for the same clients, the same employees, the same bragging rights for decades. UBS executives are well aware that absorbing Credit Suisse means absorbing all of its problems, the legal liabilities, the reputational baggage, the cultural integration nightmare. But the Swiss government is making it very clear this is not optional. Switzerland cannot allow Credit Suisse to collapse. The resulting chaos would destroy the country's reputation as a financial haven. So UBS will buy Credit Suisse. The only question is the price. The negotiations go through the night. UBS offers $1 billion. The government pushes for more. They settle on 3.25 billion Swiss francs, roughly the same in dollars. 3.25 billion for a bank that managed $1.5 trillion in assets, for an institution that was valued at 96 billion just 16 years earlier. 97% of the value gone. If you've made it this far, you're about to learn about the most controversial aspect of the entire deal, what happened to the bondholders. In any normal bankruptcy or acquisition, there's a hierarchy. Shareholders get wiped out first, then subordinated debt holders, then senior debt holders, then depositors. That's the order. It's sacred. It's the foundation of how financial markets work. Credit Suisse had a special class of bonds called AT1, Bonds Additional Tier 1 Capital Instruments. These were designed to absorb losses if a bank got into trouble. They paid high interest rates because they were risky. Investors who bought them knew they might lose money if things went badly. But here's the thing, AT1 bondholders are supposed to rank above shareholders. If a bank fails, shareholders should be wiped out completely before bondholders lose a penny. The Swiss government flipped that order. In the UBS deal, shareholders received $3.25 billion pennies on the dollar, but not zero. AT1 bondholders received nothing. $17 billion in AT1 bonds were wiped out entirely. Zeroed. Gone. The decision was technically legal under Swiss law thanks to specific provisions in the AT1 contracts, but it violated every expectation of how financial markets are supposed to work. Bondholders around the world were furious. They had been told they were senior to equity holders. They had priced their investments based on that assumption, and now Switzerland was telling them that assumption was worthless. The lawsuits started immediately. Billions of dollars in claims from investors who believed they had been illegally expropriated. The cases are still winding through courts as of this recording. But more than the legal issues, the AT1 wipeout sent a message to global investors: Swiss rules can change when convenient. Swiss contracts might not mean what you think they mean. The supposed safe haven status of Switzerland just became a lot less safe. Think about that for a second. For 150 years, Switzerland built a reputation as the most trustworthy financial jurisdiction in the world. A reputation built on rule of law, on contract sanctity, on the principle that the Swiss would never change the rules to benefit themselves at investors' expense, and then, in one weekend, they changed the rules. Whether it was the right decision is still debated. Karen Keller-Sutter insisted it wasn't a bailout, this is a commercial solution, she said, and that the alternative would have been a global financial disaster. She may well be right. The chaos of an uncontrolled Credit Suisse collapse could have been catastrophic. But the cost was Swiss credibility, and that's a currency that, once spent, is very hard to earn back. Let me take you through the immediate aftermath, because the story didn't end with the merger announcement. On Monday, March 20th, 2023, the deal was officially announced. Credit Suisse shares had already priced in the disaster. They traded at levels that implied the bank was essentially worthless. The announcement confirmed what everyone already knew. The new combined entity, UBS plus Credit Suisse, would become one of the largest banks in the world, a behemoth with a balance sheet twice the size of Switzerland's entire GDP. A single point of failure for the Swiss economy that made too big to fail seem quaint. The Credit Suisse logo, that familiar cell-shaped icon that had adorned buildings around the world for decades, began coming down almost immediately. Workers with power tools removing the signage from headquarters, the physical erasure of a 167-year-old brand. Imagine being a Credit Suisse lifer watching that happen. You gave your career to this institution. You believed in it. You told your children you worked at one of the most prestigious banks in the world, and now you're watching contractors rip the name off the building. The job cuts began within weeks. Thousands of positions marked for elimination. Entire departments told their services would no longer be needed. The human cost of the collapse was only beginning to be counted. And the questions started coming. From regulators, from politicians, from the public. How did this happen? Who was responsible? Could it have been prevented? The inquiries are still ongoing. The full accounting of what went wrong at Credit Suisse will take years to complete. But some answers are already clear. Now let's bust some myths, because the story of Credit Suisse has already been distorted by people who want simple narratives for complicated events. Myth number 1. Credit Suisse was a victim of the American banking crisis. You'll hear people say that SVB's collapse caused Credit Suisse's collapse, that the problems at Silicon Valley Bank spooked markets and unfairly tarred Credit Suisse with the same brush. The reality is far more damning. Credit Suisse was a zombie bank walking toward its grave long before SVB existed. The scandals, the losses, the years of mismanagement, the cultural rot. SVB was the spark, but Credit Suisse was the gasoline-soaked warehouse waiting to explode. If it hadn't been SVB, it would have been something else. Any shock to market confidence would have had the same effect. Credit Suisse was that fragile, that broken, that doomed. Myth number 2. This was a government bailout like 2008. Some commentators called the UBS deal a bailout and accused Swiss authorities of putting taxpayers on the hook to save wealthy bankers. The reality is more nuanced. Unlike 2008, no public money was directly used to purchase Credit Suisse. UBS paid with its own resources and took on significant risk in doing so. The Swiss National Bank provided emergency liquidity, but that's different from taxpayer-funded equity injections. However, and this is important, the Swiss government did provide guarantees to UBS against potential losses from Credit Suisse's portfolio, so taxpayers are on the hook if things go really wrong. It's not a bailout in the traditional sense, but it's not purely private either. Myth number 3. The collapse was caused by one bad decision or one bad actor. People love to find villains. Ammar al-Qudari and his absolutely not. Bill Hwang and his Archegos implosion. The management team that ignored warnings. The regulators who failed to act. The truth is far more disturbing. Credit Suisse died from a system failure, not an individual failure. Hundreds of people made hundreds of decisions over many years that cumulatively destroyed the institution. The culture was broken. The incentives were misaligned. The governance was weak. Pointing at any single person or decision and saying, "That's what killed Credit Suisse," is like pointing at a single crack in a dam and ignoring the million other cracks that were also letting water through. Now let me give you some what-if scenarios, because understanding what could have been different helps you understand why things happened the way they did. What if Credit Suisse had exited its Archegos positions when Goldman and Morgan Stanley did? The banks that moved first in March 2021 escaped with relatively minor losses. Credit Suisse hesitated, apparently hoping the positions would recover. That hesitation cost them $5.5 billion. If they had moved faster, if they had prioritized survival over hope, the loss might have been $2 billion or less. Still bad, but not catastrophic. And the chain of events that followed might have been very different. What if the spying scandal had never happened? It sounds minor compared to the financial losses, but the surveillance controversy cost Credit Suisse 2 CEOs and exposed a culture of paranoia and mistrust. It signaled to the world that this was an institution where things weren't right. Reputational damage compounds over time. Every scandal makes the next scandal worse. What if the Twitter speculation in October 2022 had been ignored? This one is harder. The tweet happened because Credit Suisse was already perceived as weak. but the viral moment accelerated the crisis dramatically. If the market had stayed calm, if the $119 billion outflow hadn't happened, maybe Corner's restructuring plan would have had time to work. Maybe the bank would have survived long enough to heal. What if Ammar al-Qudari had said no comment? This is the most tantalizing what if. Those two words, absolutely not, triggered a 24% stock collapse. If he had dodged the question, bought even a few more days of ambiguity, maybe the Swiss National Bank lifeline would have worked. Maybe confidence would have stabilized. Maybe Credit Suisse would have gotten through the crisis. Or maybe not. Maybe the bank was so far gone that no amount of verbal dancing could have saved it. We'll never know for certain. What-ifs are seductive but ultimately unanswerable. What we do know is that Credit Suisse died because of a long series of failures, and at multiple points along the way, different choices could have led to different outcomes. Let me address some of the conspiracy theories that circulate around Credit Suisse collapse, because where there's financial catastrophe, there's always speculation about hidden agendas. Theory 1. The Americans wanted Credit Suisse dead. Some European commentators suggested that the U.S.-led pressure on Credit Suisse, the constant regulatory scrutiny, the tax evasion investigations, the relentless negative press was part of a deliberate effort to weaken Swiss banking and benefit American competitors. Is there any truth to this? The American government certainly showed little sympathy for Credit Suisse's problems. Swiss banking secrecy had long been a target of U.S. prosecutors, and American banks did benefit from Credit Suisse's demise as clients and talent fled to safer shores. But conspiracy requires coordination, and there's no evidence of a deliberate American plot to kill Credit Suisse. The simpler explanation is that Credit Suisse killed itself, and the Americans just watched it happen. Theory 2. The Saudi National Bank wanted out. Another theory suggests that Ammar al-Qudari's quote wasn't a mistake, it was intentional. The Saudis had seen enough. They knew Credit Suisse was doomed. Rather than throw good money after bad, they deliberately triggered the final collapse so they could cut their losses and move on. This theory has some circumstantial appeal. The Saudis are sophisticated investors. They don't usually make public statements that move markets unless they intend to. Was absolutely not calculated rather than careless? Probably not. The Saudi National Bank's stake in Credit Suisse was worth billions. The collapse cost them enormously. It's hard to imagine they would deliberately destroy their own investment just to accelerate an inevitable outcome. Theory 3. UBS engineered the crisis. The most cynical theory suggests that UBS Credit Suisse's bitter rival for decades somehow manipulated events to acquire their competitor at a fire sale price. This is almost certainly false. UBS didn't want to buy Credit Suisse. The acquisition was essentially forced on them by the Swiss government. They're now stuck integrating a troubled institution while managing the fallout from the AT1 controversy. This is not the prize anyone would engineer for themselves. Now let's talk about what this means for you, because Credit Suisse's collapse isn't just a story about Swiss bankers and their problems. It's a story about the fragility of the systems we all depend on. First lesson, trust is everything, and trust is fragile. Credit Suisse lost the trust of its clients, its investors, its regulators, and eventually the public. Once that trust was gone, no amount of money or restructuring could bring it back. The bank wasn't killed by a single catastrophic loss. It was killed by 1,000 moments when people decided they didn't believe in it anymore. This applies to every institution in your life. Your bank, your employer, your government. Trust takes years to build and moments to destroy. And in the age of social media, those destructive moments can happen faster than ever. Second lesson, the too big to fail problem hasn't been solved. After 2008, regulators around the world promised they had fixed the banking system. More capital requirements, more stress tests, more oversight. Never again would taxpayers be put on the hook to save failing banks. Credit Suisse proved that promise was hollow. When push came to shove, the Swiss government had to intervene because the alternative was too terrifying. And now Switzerland has an even bigger bank, UBS plus Credit Suisse, that is even more too big to fail than before. The same is true in America, in Europe, in Asia. The largest banks are larger than ever. The systemic risks are greater than ever. And when the next crisis hits, governments will face the same impossible choices. Third lesson: social media has changed everything. Credit Suisse was the first major bank to die in the Twitter era. A viral tweet in October 2022 triggered outflows of $119 billion. A televised quote in March 2023 triggered a 24% stock collapse. Information and misinformation now moves faster than any institution can respond. This creates a new kind of vulnerability. Banks have always been susceptible to runs moments when everyone wants their money at the same time. But traditionally, runs required physical presence. People had to show up at branches, line up, demand their deposits. Now a run can happen in seconds. Clients can move billions with a few clicks on their phones. By the time a bank's management even realizes there's a problem, it might already be too late. Fourth lesson: Switzerland is no longer a safe haven. For generations, wealthy people around the world sent their money to Switzerland because they trusted Swiss banks and Swiss laws. That reputation was worth hundreds of billions in deposits and fees. The Credit Suisse debacle damaged that reputation severely. The AT1 wipeout showed that Swiss rules can be changed when convenient. The forced merger showed that even the largest Swiss banks can fail. The discretion that was supposed to define Swiss banking was violated in the most public way imaginable. Will Switzerland recover its reputation? Probably, eventually. But it will take years of scandal-free operations to rebuild what was lost in one chaotic weekend. Let me take you back to that Sunday night, March 19, 2023 one more time, because there's a moment in this story that captures everything about how banking works and how it fails. Inside the Swiss government buildings, the final documents are being signed. UBS has agreed to buy Credit Suisse. The AT1 bondholders have been wiped out. The deal will be announced in hours. In Zurich, the parade platz is quiet. The great stone buildings still stand, lit by street lamps, looking as permanent as they have for a century. If you didn't know what was happening, you might think everything was fine. But inside those buildings, people are packing boxes, clearing out desks, sending farewell emails to colleagues they worked with for decades. The Credit Suisse name is already being removed from internal systems, replaced by UBS templates. 167 years of history is ending not with a bang, but with a whimper, with bureaucratic forms and legal documents and the quiet hum of servers being reconfigured. The Asian markets open. The world absorbs the news. The immediate panic that everyone feared doesn't materialize. The deal has calmed the markets for now. The contagion has been contained, but something has been lost that can never be recovered. Not just a bank, but an idea. The idea that some institutions are permanent. The idea that stability can be taken for granted. The idea that the system will always hold. Credit Suisse death proved that nothing is too big to fail. Nothing is too old to die. Nothing is too trusted to collapse. If you've made it this far, you understand that Credit Suisse isn't just a story about one bank. It's a story about our entire financial system and its terrifying vulnerabilities. The bank didn't die because of one mistake or one villain. It died because of a culture that prioritized profits over prudence. It died because of regulators who saw problems and didn't act forcefully enough. It died because of a social media ecosystem that can turn rumors into reality. It died because trust, once lost, cannot be recovered on any timeline that matters. And here's the brutal truth. There are other Credit Suisses out there right now. Banks and institutions that are accumulating problems year after year. Banks that are making headlines for all the wrong reasons. Banks that are slowly losing the trust of the people they depend on. Some of them are in America. Some are in Europe. Some are in Europe. You may have your money in one of them right now. I'm not saying this to scare you. I'm saying this because awareness matters. The clients who pulled their money from Credit Suisse in late 2022 before the final collapse protected themselves. They paid attention to the warning signs. They didn't assume that a famous name and a long history guaranteed safety. That awareness is what separates the survivors from the victims in every financial crisis. So here's my challenge to you. Where is your money right now? Do you know? Have you checked? Not just which bank, but what risks that bank is taking. What scandals have they been involved in? What their balance sheet looks like? What the people who follow banking closely are saying about their stability. You don't need to become a financial expert, but you do need to be aware. You need to recognize that the institutions you trust with your life savings are not infallible. They can make mistakes, they can be poorly managed, they can lose your trust and then lose your money. Credit Suisse's clients who stayed until the end mostly got their deposits back, thanks to Swiss Deposit Insurance and the UBS deal. They were lucky. The next time a major bank fails, the outcome might not be so clean. Be the client who pays attention. Be the investor who asks questions. Be the person who recognizes that 200 years of history can be erased in 2 days. Because the forces that killed Credit Suisse, the scandals, the mismanagement, the social media panic, the lost trust, they're not unique to Switzerland. They're present in banking systems everywhere, and they're waiting for the next weak institution to consume. Let me give you one final image. It's a few weeks after the merger. A construction crew is working at the Parade Platz headquarters. They're removing the Credit Suisse signage, that distinctive sail logo that had been a landmark for generations. A crowd has gathered to watch. Some of them are former employees. Some are just curious passers-by. Some are photographers documenting the end of an era. The workers use power tools to pry the letters off the building. CREDIT. One by one, they come down. SUISS. Each letter carried away like a piece of a corpse. When they're done, the facade is bare, just stone, just the building, stripped of its identity, waiting for new signage, new owners, a new name. Behind that facade, the real work continues. UBS teams integrating systems, lawyers reviewing contracts, regulators watching for problems, the actual business of banking continuing as it always does, regardless of what name is on the door. But something is gone that was there before, something intangible but real. The idea that Credit Suisse was permanent, that it would always be there, that you could walk past that building in 50 years and see the same name you saw in your childhood. That certainty is gone, and it's never coming back. If you found this video valuable, hit that subscribe button. Next week we're diving deep into another financial catastrophe, the story of long-term capital management, the hedge fund run by Nobel Prize winners that nearly destroyed the global economy in 1998. Same hubris, same blindness to risk, same assumption that smart people can't fail. Leave a comment below. Do you trust banks more or less than you did before watching this video? Have you ever moved your money because you lost faith in an institution? I read every comment, and I want to know if the Credit Suisse story changed how you think about where you keep your savings. And share this video with someone who thinks their bank is too big to fail. Because after Credit Suisse, that phrase should be permanently retired. No bank is too big to fail. No institution is too old to die. No trust is too deep to be betrayed. This was the story of Credit Suisse, 167 years of history, destroyed in days, sold for $3 billion and change. 2 words from a man in Saudi Arabia. $17 billion in bonds wiped out. 50,000 employees wondering what comes next. Absolutely not. The most expensive quote in Swiss history.